Today I'm out here in North Carolina with the pinnacle of golf performance, the all-new Golf R. As we typically see with Volkswagen, this is the model that's been available in Europe for a little bit, and now it is here in the United States, the 8th generation Golf R. The important thing to know about the 8th generation Golf is that there is no regular Golf anymore. All Golf models in the US are performance-oriented. We have the GTI, and then we have the Golf R, the pinnacle of Golf performance. Even though the name of the Volkswagen platform that the Golf is built on has the same name as the 7th generation Golf, this is an entirely new generation model. And it definitely looks the part of the Volkswagen Golf, but also definitely a more modern vehicle. Unlike the GTI, we have a different lower bumper treatment, pretty similar upper end right here. Blue accent striping on the R differentiates it from the red accent striping that we find on the GTI, and then we have full LED headlights. Moving around to the side, we have unique wheels, tires, and brakes in the R model. The brakes are bigger than in the GTI. They're also blue painted, and then we have cross-rolled rotors. These are 235 with 35 aspect ratio 19-inch tires. There's really not a lot of rubber on there, but thankfully, there has an adaptive suspension system that really helps improve the ride and really in large part compensate for those really low profile tires. Moving fully around to the side, Volkswagen has kept the very pragmatic hatchback proportions of the Golf. They haven't turned this into a liftback or a sportback like we see with the Honda Civic hatchback. I would argue that the Civic hatchback isn't really a hatchback at all. It's really more of a sportback or a liftback. It's an awful lot longer in order to accommodate the definitely swoopy proportions that we see in that Honda. The upside for the Volkswagen is improved rear seat headroom versus what we see in the Honda, and a very practical and square cargo area while still maintaining the very practical exterior dimensions that you'd expect out of a hot hatch. Obviously, 4 doors are found here. There is no 2-door version of the Golf for 2022 in the United States. Out back, we have a number of changes to differentiate the R from the GTI. We have a bigger spoiler right up top and these massive quad exhaust tips below. I really like the new R stylized logo that we find under the Volkswagen logo. And as we've seen in Volkswagens before, this houses the backup camera and the release for the hatch. So we simply push it there, pop the hatch up like that, and then when you're in reverse, that pops open to give you the backup camera. Under the hood, we find a Volkswagen 2-liter turbo that has its dial cranked all the way up to 11. This produces 315 horsepower, and depending on whether you get the dual clutch transmission or the manual transmission, up to 295 pound-feet of torque. I would argue that if you're debating between the manual transmission and the automatic transmission in the Golf R, I would probably get the automatic, as much fun as the manual transmission is. The automatic transmission gives you 15 pound-feet more torque, and the horsepower curve is a little bit different as well. With the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, peak torque happens about 300 RPM lower, and this is definitely going to be the fastest way to get 0 to 60. That's why even though I was able to drive the R with the manual transmission and the dual-clutch, I chose to spend my day in the dual-clutch version. Rounding out the reasons to get the DSG transmission, fuel economy improves to 26 miles per gallon combined. If you get the manual, you only get 23, which is fairly low for a compact hatch. I'm going to give front seat comfort 9 out of 10 points for the moment. We have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a power driver's seat with a 3-position memory, tilt telescopic steering column with a really large range of motion. Now the front passenger seat remains a manual design even in the Golf R. Perhaps the thing I love most about the Golf is the seating position, front or rear. It's definitely more upright, more crossover-like than we find in the average compact sedan or hatchback. That's always been the case with the Golf, and it continues with this 8th generation. That means that if you're a taller person or you just prefer a more upright, more visible seating position, this is going to be an excellent choice. The front seat tracks also move decently rearward, so if you're a taller driver and you want something small, easy to park with excellent performance, as you can see, there's a lot of room in here. Now, you will end up sitting right here, right next to the B-pillar in the vehicle, but this could still accommodate 6'5" and taller people. Jumping into the back, we also find tons of headroom. I have about 1.5 inches of headroom, which is definitely more than we find in the Civic hatch. And because this generation of WRX is sedan only, certainly more headroom than we find in that Subaru. Also lots of practical touches back here, like little pockets right back here in the front seat back. So if you do want to put kids in the back of your Golf R, it could be a little bit tricky with some rear-facing child seats, but those older kids will definitely have places to stick their goodies. Seat back pockets there and 2 on top. We also have 3-zone climate control in here with controls right there in the center console with heated rear seats as well. Scooting all the way over to the right side, you'll definitely notice that legroom is a little bit at a premium here. So if you want extra legroom, you'll find that in some of the competition, but headroom for me is a little bit more important. The rear seats still fold in a 60-40 fashion, giving you excellent cargo practicality. Cargo practicality is a big reason to buy the Golf R over a performance sedan. Even though we don't have quite as much cargo capacity behind the second row seats as we find in some of those vehicles, this is more practical because you could remove this little cargo divider. Now this is one of the hard style cargo dividers, which is not exactly my preference. It's a little bit trickier to remove than I would like, but you can pull it completely out of the vehicle and then line up more cargo right back there behind the second row seats. Say like this 22-inch roller bag. You could line up about 5 of them across there. And of course you could fold the seats down and put a barbecue back here, something that you could not do in the new WRX. Under the load floor, we don't find a spare tire, but if you wanted to put one in the vehicle, it wouldn't take up quite as much room as you'd think. You could remove this subwoofer right here. Obviously, the load floor couldn't go exactly where you might want it to go, but you might be able to squeeze it in. And we have an area where you could store the cargo cover in a pinch. Taking a quick spin around the interior, a lot of these parts are the same as the GTI, but they definitely have their own Golf R twist. We have a pretty decently sized moonroof over the driver and front passengers' heads, but it's not a panoramic design. It doesn't go to the rear passenger compartment. We find height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, fixed height headrests here with a lot of blue accenting. This is not a complete blue back to the seat. You can actually see that it goes back to charcoal for the rear of the seat. In addition to the blue accents, we also have a weave pattern embossed into the leather. There's the R logo right there in the center of that seat back. These seats are both heated and ventilated up front, and as you can see, we have pretty aggressive bolstering for these front seats, but I do find these really quite comfortable. The shoulder area is not constricted as we see in some sport seat designs, so even if you're a little bit larger, you should find these seats very comfortable. There's plenty of support there. The trim on the doors and dashboard kind of reminds me of knurled metal. Soft touch materials happen on the top of the door, but we do find some hard plastics on the main portions of the door to help improve durability around that insert. So this ring sort of around the insert, that's all hard plastic. We find hard plastics down there at the bottom of the door, for instance, right there around that storage cubby. Moving over to the dashboard, the design is definitely very modern Volkswagen with a little bit of Audi tossed in here as well, which is no bad thing. We have a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, more of that trim right there that we saw on the door over here on the dash, and then a design that kind of looks like an air vent running right across. There's this chrome strip that connects this air vent to the one over there on the passenger side, but there's no air vent right here in the middle. Below that, we have a pretty decently sized bin-style glove compartment. You'd have no problem fitting some of the larger tablet computers inside. Moving back over to the middle of the dashboard, we have a large touchscreen infotainment system. This is running basically the same software that we first saw in the Volkswagen ID.4 in the United States. It supports smartphone integration like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, factory navigation as well. This software is a little bit slower than the software that we find in some other mainstream vehicles, but it is pretty intuitive and easy to use. My only complaint about this, and some folks have noted that, is that climate controls are inside this infotainment system as well. Below the screen, there's a bank of touch buttons. We have a power button for the system, temperature controls, and then a volume slider right there in the middle. Below that, we have some other touch buttons that work with that infotainment system. So for instance, this is the button that brings you to that assistant system. You can also press it again to bring you back to the main menu. P is for the parking assist systems on the vehicle. We then have a climate button right over here, and then this button is for the vehicle mode changes. Below that, we have 2 large air vents, then 2 USB ports. Those definitely seem to provide a decent amount of power for charging batteries, a place where you can store your smartphone, and then a unique center console design versus the GTI. This has a joystick style shifter, so we press forward for reverse, pull back for drive. It's not a double tap design like we find in Volvos. You actually have 2 detents in there, so you can just tap forward for neutral. Park is this button right here, engine start stop button, very small storage cubby there, and then an electric parking brake. Between the front seats, we find a combination cup holder and storage area. I simply press that button to have the cup holder pop out of this area that gives the cup a little bit of support and separates it from this cup holder area. There's a 12-volt power port right there, a center console here that ratchets into position, slides forward and backward as an armrest, and then opens to reveal a pretty decently sized storage compartment for a small car like the Golf. The heads-up display is definitely a nice touch in the new Golf R and the new GTI as well. It gives us turn-by-turn navigation directions, speed limit, and of course the status of the active safety systems as well. Below that, we find Volkswagen's excellent LCD disco dash. I love the fact that Volkswagen is bringing this as standard equipment to so many different vehicles in their lineup. This is not quite as configurable as, say, the LCD dash that we find in modern Audi models, but it's pretty close, and it's much more configurable than the LCDs that we find in a wide variety of other mainstream vehicles. It has satellite navigation right there in the middle if your vehicle is so equipped. You can get an analog view, you can configure a lot of the displays in here as an active safety view right there, and in some of these views you can even decide what is contained inside these round modules on each side. That's done using the touch controls over here on the right side of the steering wheel. In this display mode, for instance, you can choose what you want to see over there on the right side, in the center, and on the left side of the display separately. Moving out to the entire steering wheel, we have some pretty aggressive sport grips. There are bumps out here on the bottom, bumps on the inside, up top, big paddle shifters on the back. These are bigger than we find on the GTI. There's also an R button on the steering wheel that brings you to some of the custom drive mode settings for the system. We have the controls for the adaptive cruise control over here on the left side, the multifunction LCD instrument cluster over here on the right side, along with the heated steering wheel control, and then Volkswagen puts the infotainment controls on either side. Volume up, down on the left, track forward, backward on the right. Speaking of drive modes, the R gives us a few different drive modes. We have Comfort, Sport, Race. If we engage Race, and then wait for that little display to pop up, we also have a Drift mode there, a Special mode, which is an interesting touch, that really ratchets things up to the next level, and then of course a Custom mode as well. One of the most interesting things about the Custom mode is just how much customization you can get. You can see exactly how many settings there are between the firmest suspension setting in this vehicle all the way up there, and then the least firm setting for the DCC all the way down there. We don't have quite as many options for some of these other drive mode settings, but I love the fact that Volkswagen has given us so much customization. Now let's get the R out on the road. According to Volkswagen, this should go 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds if you get the dual clutch transmission, and I definitely believe them. There's definitely a visceral sound coming from the 2-liter turbo, and I like the fact that Volkswagen has given us so many different drive modes. If I press the R button here on the steering wheel, it'll automatically put me in race mode, but I can also use the menu that pops up to put it in custom mode or whatever mode I wanted to be in. Now, one of the interesting things that I said earlier about custom mode is that you can have things like the race drivetrain tune with the softest suspension tune available, which is actually on the softer side of things from Comfort. I like the fact that Volkswagen has given us a wicked fast Golf, but also one that is eminently daily driver livable. If you don't like the digital augmented exhaust sounds, you can even turn that off in the custom mode. Unfortunately, I don't have any official performance scores for the Golf R just yet, so be sure and stay tuned because hopefully I will have this at home very soon. But I wouldn't be surprised if 4.7 seconds was definitely achievable. With the manual transmission, honestly, it's going to be dependent on exactly how much you want to roast your clutch. I could see some folks out there getting repeatable 5-second 0 to 60 times. Some people could come in a little bit slower. Depending on exactly what you're doing with the vehicle, that means that the Golf R could be faster or slower than some of the direct competition, depending on exactly what you're comparing it to, whether that's an automatic to automatic comparison or an automatic to a manual comparison, or honestly, manual to manual as well. That's especially important for an all-wheel drive vehicle like the Golf R. Generally, all-wheel drive with a turbocharged engine, especially a smaller turbocharged engine, you're going to get more of a bogging feel launching the vehicle unless you really want to roast the clutch. As you'd expect from the pinnacle of Golf performance, handling is absolutely excellent in this model, and I have to say, impressive even when it's in its most comfortable suspension setting. This beautiful road out here in North Carolina isn't exactly paved perfectly, and there are definitely some dips and dives in the corners, and some vehicles with adaptive suspension systems, when they're in their softest setting, they can kind of come unglued a little bit in these settings, and that doesn't happen in this. And of course, if you want to get the most out of your Golf R, you just press the R button on the steering wheel that puts it in race mode, where we get more aggressive programming for the engine, more aggressive programming for the transmission, and of course, more aggressive suspension settings as well. To be honest, out on the road, this doesn't feel like too many other mainstream vehicles. The steering is sharp, it's quick, it's easy to understand exactly what all the tires are doing. Even though feedback from the front tires is not the best, this is better than most with electric power steering. Really, this reminds me a lot of an AMG version of the Mercedes-Benz GLA. And that's pretty good company when we're talking about a Volkswagen. The GLA has a very visceral, very raw feeling to it as well, but oddly enough, this actually feels more like a luxury car in terms of the way that it feels and drives out on the road than that Mercedes GLA. This has the same sort of directness, the same sort of tautness in the suspension when it's in its race mode, but if you put it in the comfort mode, this is more comfortable and more livable. If you're surprised by that, I would say that you shouldn't be. To be honest, a lot of modern AMG models have become, in my opinion, a little bit too firm for having a Mercedes logo on the same vehicle. Rather unfortunately, I have yet to actually drive the new Subaru WRX. So far, I've only been driven in the new WRX. But the adaptive suspension system in that vehicle does not offer you quite as many choices as far as the way it can be configured versus what we see in the Golf R. This also definitely seems to have less body roll than we find in the WRX. The WRX is sort of loosely based on an Impreza or related to an Impreza, but it's not exactly an Impreza copy. But when designing that vehicle, it's clear that Subaru was going in a slightly different direction. It's also a little bit bigger than this. I suspect you'll really notice the difference out on an autocross course or a really winding mountain road like the one that I'm on here. The Golf R is just so much fun, this feels so chuckable, and the all-wheel drive system just gives this a level of grip that you might not expect, and it really improves performance in the corners. Now, this is never going to be quite the rear-wheel drive machine that you might want, but Volkswagen's inclusion of a drift mode really is intriguing. Rather unfortunately, however, that is the one mode I was not able to test out here in North Carolina. Volkswagen did not provide us with any sort of facility in order to do that kind of testing. This Golf R is just so much fun, from the exhaust burbles to the impeccable handling, the quick steering, and the fact that if you don't need to be boy racer on the weekend, I can just hit this drive mode button here, put it into the comfort mode. Let's go ahead and do that. And then this becomes an eminently livable vehicle. Really surprising for the kind of tires that we have on this. They are very, very low profile, and Volkswagen has done an excellent job tuning the suspension. This is the kind of vehicle that looks sporty on the outside, but if you want to take your grandma to lunch, she's not going to be offended by the vehicle. She's not going to think that you went crazy and bought some absolutely rock-hard sports car. If you want to get your hands on the new Golf R, these should be on dealer lots shortly, so be sure and contact your local Volkswagen dealer. It's going to start at $43,645, and if you want the dual clutch transmission, it goes up to $44,445. That's still a pretty good deal as far as performance all-wheel drive vehicles go. And to be honest, in the United States, there's not a lot of competition, especially if you really want the practical, pragmatic hatchback profile that we find in the Golf R, and it's easy to park nature. If you live in an urban or a suburban area where parking can be tight, this is going to be an awful lot easier to live with than a Civic Si or a Civic hatch, because those are actually quite a bit bigger than this. As far as competition goes, we have the new Subaru WRX, which is all-wheel drive, but it's not going to be quite as much fun if you get the automatic transmission, because the Subaru Performance automatic transmission really is just a continuously variable automatic transmission. It is certainly not as engaging as the dual clutch that we find in the Golf R. You can get a manual transmission in that vehicle as well, but you're not going to get as much power as we find in the Golf R. I also love the all-wheel drive tech that we find in this vehicle. I think this all-wheel drive system is superior in the way that it feels and the way that it can move the car out on the road. You could also take a look at something like the upcoming Honda Civic Type R, but the Civic Type R isn't going to be all-wheel drive. Honda has yet to announce a Civic Type R exactly, but we do know that one is expected. It's probably going to be in their supposed hatchback format, which is really more of a sportback or liftback, as I said before. We don't know how much power it's going to have. I wouldn't be surprised if it was equal to or greater than this, but that system is not going to motivate all four wheels. And as we've seen with Honda in the past, it's unlikely to come with an automatic transmission, because Honda does not have an automatic capable of that much power at the moment. I know a few Volkswagen fans that have been offended by the price tag on this model. Again, over $44,000 with the dual clutch transmission. That is definitely inside Audi territory, but it's important to remember that every model is going to come basically equipped as you've seen it here. There's a ton of standard feature content, and if you want all the features that we find on this Golf R on your Audi, you will be paying more, generally speaking. So this is still a decent value proposition. You could also compare this to something like a BMW 2 Series or perhaps a Mercedes-Benz CLA or a GLA. This is a little bit closer to the GLA in terms of its general format, but the GLA is going to cost you an awful lot more. Now, you can get a much more powerful GLA, but it'll be tens of thousands of dollars more expensive. The GLA 35 is probably the closest corollary to this. It's already going to be more expensive. The GLA 45, even more powerful, even more expensive. For now, bottom lining, the Golf R is super simple. This is the absolute ultimate hot hatch in America right now. Over 300 horsepower, all-wheel drive, slick dual clutch transmission, and a price tag that won't break the bank. If you're shopping for a mainstream performance vehicle, especially if you're looking at the Subaru WRX or the upcoming Honda Civic Type R, I would definitely put the Golf R on your shopping list. I love the look inside, and I love the amount of tech, and of course, the all-wheel drive system that we find on this that we won't find on the next generation Type R. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what do you think of the price tag on the new Golf R. Again, this is going to be about the same price as some comparable Audi models, depending on exactly what you're looking, but you're going to get more feature content in this. When you really start digging, you'll notice that they're not really comparable in terms of the feature content. You may get an Audi with similar amounts of power, but not with the same kind of features. You'll definitely be paying more. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you later.